My name is Shelley Milligan. I am the Managing Director of the Carver Project. If you're new to the Carver Project, we are also new, a nonprofit that started just a couple of years ago. Our mission is to empower Christian faculty and students to serve and connect university, church, and society. We're so glad that you're here tonight for our dialogue with Jemar Tisby and John Anazu. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, the School of Law, and American Culture Studies in Arts and Sciences. We're so grateful for our on-campus partners. Tonight's event will begin with a talk from Mr. Tisby. It will be followed by a dialogue with Professor Anazu, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. Following questions and answers, we'll have a reception and a book signing. Books, if you have not purchased The Color of Compromise, we'll have those for sale. And I also want to remember to tell you that someone left their keys at the registration table. I know you're all going to look now. They will be there. You will have to identify the make and model of car. That's the quiz. So that should be an easy quiz if you're missing your keys. Don't panic, they'll be there. First, I'm going to introduce John Anazu, who will be coming up second. John is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, a second book, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, and the forthcoming book with Tim Keller, Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference, now available for pre-order. John is also the Executive Director of the Carver Project. Jemar Tisby is the President of The Witness, a Black Christian collective where he writes about race, religion, and culture. He's also the co-host of Pass the Mic, a podcast that amplifies dynamic voices for a diverse church. Jemar's writing has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, CNN, Vox, and the New York Times. He has spoken nationwide at conferences on racial justice, U.S. history, and the church. He's the author of The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. I can testify. Good book. Jemar is a PhD candidate studying history at the University of Mississippi. He's studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. His BA is from Notre Dame, and his MDiv is from RTS Jackson. You can follow him at Twitter, on Twitter at Jemar Tisby. And now, guest of honor. Thanks, Jemar.
It was September 15th, 1963. Four little girls, Addie Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. They were at the Youth Day Sunday service, 16th Street Baptist Church, and they were making final adjustments on their white dresses in the church basement when the bomb exploded. It left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It decapitated poor Cynthia. Her parents could only tell it was their baby girl by the ring on her finger and the shoes she was wearing. Of course, in the aftermath, people not only across the nation but across the country expressed outrage. How could such a thing happen? In the aftermath, a white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. spoke the next day to a group of young white businessmen, and he changed his topic at the last minute to address this tragedy that has shaken their city. And he tells this group of all white businessmen, he asked them a question. He said, "Who threw it?" Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? And he tells this group of all white men in Birmingham, the answer should be, we all did it. Every last one of us. He said, we're condemned for that crime and for the bombing before it and for a decade ago, we all did it. But he didn't leave the church out of the equation. He talks about Christians, and he said the who is every little individual who talks about the nigger and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rock the party with laughter. Then he asked of Christian ministers, did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and sisters and express their regrets in person or pray with crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks of their church? Now listen, of course, there were plenty of people who outright constructed and supported racism and racial terror. The people who donned robes and hoods, who burnt crosses on lawns, and who planted dynamite at churches. But if that's your only definition of racism and what a racist does, then it's too easy to let ourselves off the hook. It's too easy to point the finger and say, look, it's them. Those are the real racists. I'm not part of it. But I think what Charles Morgan Jr. was getting at in his speech and asking who did it and saying it was all of us is this idea of complicity. So, true enough, the people who were actively planting bombs and doing these racist acts may have been quantitatively a minority. They couldn't have done what they did without the silence, the ignorance, the apathy of a vast majority of people, including Christians. And so, the idea of compromise and complicity is this: that the most egregious acts of racism, like a church bomb, can only happen within a context of compromise. Right. So, this presentation is entitled, What is the Color of Compromise? And it's a question I'm surprised I don't get more often, given the title, The Color of Compromise, right? I would think it would be natural for people to say, okay, what is the color of compromise? Is it pink? Is it powder blue? Is it periwinkle? Which I don't know what that looks like. If anybody's wearing periwinkle, let me know. But I want to propose to you this evening that the color of compromise is at least 3 different colors. The color of compromise is green, for the greed that propped up a white supremacist system and race-based chattel slavery. The color of compromise is white, for an ideology that places white people at the top or the center of society and people of color, especially black people, at the margins. And the color of compromise is red, because to support the greed and the white supremacy, at the end of the day, you had to use bloody violence. So we're going to talk about each of these in turn. Before we do, I want to say this is all an introduction to a conversation. If you want to learn more, I do a lot of ranting and raving on social media. I also do a lot of historical posting, and so you can visit our websites, thewitnessbcc.com, as well as my own website, JemarTisby.com, and I have not one but 2 podcasts for your listening pleasure. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Cast and Mike, I co-host with Tyler Burns. We talk about everything under the sun from a Black Christian perspective, and Footnotes is one I started more recently. It's my solo podcast where I talk about current events from a Black Christian perspective. So I encourage you to check those out if you want to continue the conversation. Okay, let's get in. Oh, by the way, I don't like monologues, so if you want to talk back, it's okay. I know we're not in church, but if I say something that you agree with, say it. You can say an amen. You can say, it's all right. It's all right to talk back, okay? Give me some help up here. This ain't easy stuff. Also, by the way, I don't know where you are. You may love this idea. You may hate it. But we're going to be in this journey together, and I think the best way to do it in our limited time is for me to just be honest. So I'm going to say things like black and white and racism and racist and white supremacy and all of these things that are kind of trigger words in our society. But let's just agree that in this room, for the sake of time, efficiency, and honesty, that we're going to go in, we're going to think the best of each other, and we're going to take this journey together. Can we do that? All right. Here we go. That's what I like. There you go. We got it. The color of compromise is green. So, I want to start with this quote by James W.C. Pennington, who was a Black minister and abolitionist in the 1800s. He said this: "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle. And the cart whip, the starvation, the nakedness are its inevitable consequences." So, a lot of people like to say that slavery was America's original sin. I think it might be more accurate to say that slavery was America's original symptom, and its original sin was greed. So let's break it down. Race-based chattel slavery. Chattel, C-H-A-T-T-E-L, means property. So race-based chattel slavery means that human beings were considered property. Why? Because in a capitalist system, what's the goal? Maximize profit, minimize loss. If you've ever been in charge of a budget or even just seen one, you know that typically your biggest outlay is toward wages, salaries, and benefits for your workers. So if you want to increase your bottom line, the best way to do that is to cut those wages, salary, and benefits. But better yet, don't pay your workers at all. That's what happened in race-based chattel slavery. For centuries, people of African descent literally built this country, chopped down trees, drained swamps, picked the cotton, built the buildings for no remuneration. The reason why slavery has such resiliency, it's not just because of racism, it wasn't that, but because there was money to be made. That's why if you go to the Mississippi Articles of Secession, January 1861, it says this: "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce on the earth." See that? Material interest. Its labor supplies commerce. There's money to be had. By the way, don't let anyone ever tell you that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. I live in the South. A lot of people try to say, "Oh, it was about states' rights." And I'm always like, yeah, you're right. But the states' right to do what? Enslave people. And why did it take America's bloodiest war to bring about emancipation? Why couldn't it gradually come about through a process of changing laws or changing hearts? Why did it take hundreds of thousands of deaths within the United States to bring about emancipation? It's because it was profitable to enslave people. This is why, if you look at a slave ship, they weren't built for comfort. Most slave ships weren't built to transport many people at all. They had to be retrofitted. And when they were retrofitted, the designers didn't think about the comfort of the passengers. They thought about the passengers as property or as cargo. same as you would gunpowder or boxes of produce. If you're packing to move somewhere, you pack and arrange things in order to fit them as much as possible in one trip, and they did the same thing with human beings. What got me is that they would always count on attrition, which meant death. And as you're researching, some random facts tend to stick out. One of those random facts that sticks out to me was that sharks used to follow behind the slave ships because when people died, they didn't have anywhere to put them, so they would just toss them into the sea, and sharks are natural scavengers, so they follow these slave ships and they get a free meal. The chattel principle. People treated as property, as carnal, as commodities, to enrich the people who owned plantations and other businesses. There's a man named Olaudah Equiano. He was kidnapped from the area now known as Nigeria. He was of the Igbo tribe. He was about 11 years old when he and his sister were kidnapped and enslaved. And he talks about this issue of family separation. He said, he wrote an autobiography, and in it he writes about being separated from his sister. He says this: "The next day proved of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms. It was in vain that we besought them, the slave traders, not to part us, but she was torn from me, and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth." And then Equiano, who became a Christian, he noticed that many enslavers, they themselves professed Christianity. But as many marginalized people and black Christians did, they saw through the hypocrisy. And so this is what Equiano asks of these Christian slave traders and owners. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Are you obeying the golden rule, Christian? As you tear my sister from my arms and sell us like property? There's one more quote I want to share with you about this greed inherent in the system. It comes from a historian, Forrest G. Wood. And he says, cynical though it may sound, it's not an exaggeration to submit that the critical fact in determining who opposed slavery and who supported it was a consequence entirely of political and economic factors. All the Christian conviction in the world could not dent the purse of one slaveholder. All the Christian conviction in the world couldn't shake them of their real God, money. That's why I don't think we're having any serious conversations about racial justice unless we're talking about money. How can you say that you can enslave an entire people for centuries, enrich yourself off of their labor, rape their women to create more slaves, which creates more property, which creates more wealth for yourself, never pay them, separate families, fight a bloody war for emancipation, and then say, good luck, without any financial consideration whatsoever? How do we look at things like the racial wealth gap? There are a lot of people who will simply say, oh, well, black people are poor because they're lazy. They don't work hard. The American dream is open to them, they just don't want it. You can say that. It would be racist. Or you can say there's something wrong with the system, and we need to do something about that. We can delve further into that, and there are economists who are experts on researching the idea of reparations. But how can we talk about racial justice without acknowledging the economically exploitative system that has been the legacy of race-based child slavery? The color of compromise is green. The color of compromise is also white. So it's not just an economic, material, financial aspect to all of this. There's an ideological aspect to it as well. One of the themes in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. And so we can look at different manifestations of racism. There would be, you could say, 3 major periods of racism. One was race-based chattel slavery. Another after that was the Jim Crow era, in which legalized segregation was the law of the land. And then the current era we're living in is an era of systemic inequality or a racialized society where many of society's benefits are still apportioned along racial lines, even without explicit race-based laws. Why? Why after emancipation weren't we done with racism? Why after Brown v. Board weren't we done with racism? It's because of white supremacy. White supremacy is a story we tell ourselves about race. Or as my friend Daniel Hill, who wrote the book White's the Weight, says, white supremacy is the narrative of racial difference, the story of racial difference. So until we change that story of racial difference, we're always going to have racism creep up in different ways. Bryan Stevenson, the founder and president of the Equal Justice Initiative, said the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And he's right. That this ideological battle about race and whiteness and white supremacy and what that means is still happening every day in our society. The color of compromise is white. And so as we talk about the color of compromise being white, what I'm really talking about is this idea of whiteness. I want you to separate white people from whiteness. Okay? So, what whiteness does is at least 3 things. First of all, whiteness erases ethnicity. And I'm talking mainly for white people. So at some point, you had ancestors come over from Europe. And when they came over from Europe, they were British or French or Swedish or Dutch, perhaps Italian. But when they hit these shores, in this racialized society, this white supremacist society, Europeans from all these different places became white. And what happened is all that history that you had got erased in exchange for something called whiteness, which over here had more currency than being Dutch or French or whatever it was. So a lot of people willingly traded that because it was better to be white than to be some ethnic or national specific group. And it was certainly better to be white than black. And so one of the things that I think will help white people acknowledge their whiteness, this ideology, right, is a recovery of your national and ethnic heritage. See, when you traded whiteness, your ethnic and national heritage for whiteness, some on purpose, some just over time, gradually, what happened was you lost all that culture, all that history, the language, the food, the dances. And now, all you have left to lean on is whiteness. Whiteness necessarily is anti-black, which I'll get to in a minute. When I was in seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, it was so interesting. It drew students from all over the nation, white students mostly, and you'd have these guys coming from like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wyoming, and they'd come down to Jackson, Mississippi, and within about a semester or 2, all of a sudden, these guys from all over the country started wearing bow ties and growing beards and wearing seersucker. And I'm like, what are you doing? This is not your culture. You're not a Southern gentleman. What is this? What I realized was that in the South, there was a very distinct culture for white people and for white males. And coming from different parts of the country into the South, where there was very apparent what it meant to be white and what it meant to be a white man and a wealthy and educated white man, they leaned into that because it was something they could grasp. It was something they could celebrate. But what they didn't realize is that leaning into that whiteness meant being opposed to black people and blackness. Because that's the second thing whiteness does. It creates this equal and opposite category of black, where everything white is considered central and normal and good, and that which is considered black is considered abnormal and marginal and perhaps bad. Right? And then there's a spectrum of everyone in between. So it doesn't just create this category of blackness, it creates the category of white and non-white. And there's this spectrum that encompasses Latin Americans and people of Asian descent and Native Americans and, of course, black people. So we're all caught up in this thing. And to the degree that you either look white or identify with white culture, you can make it. You can pass. You can assimilate. Until something happens that reminds people that you're really not white. So nobody is escaping this thing. Now, what does that have to do with Christianity and compromise? Well, this idea of whiteness gets wrapped up with Christianity and nationalism. There's been a lot of talk in the news about white nationalism. I think we need to equally talk about something called white Christian nationalism. So a lot of people don't realize that the Ku Klux Klan had three major iterations. One was right after the Civil War, one was during the Civil Rights Movement, and then one was in the height of Jim Crow in 1915. There was this movie called Birth of a Nation. It was the first blockbuster hit of Hollywood. It was a 3-hour-long silent film that purported to tell about the noble origins of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. There's a whole thing we can get into about that movie and its propaganda. Suffice it to say, it inspired white supremacists, Christian white supremacists. So what they did on Thanksgiving Day, 1915, they go to the top of this place, Stone Mountain, Georgia. On its front are 3 Confederate heroes. They go to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, and in a tradition taken from Scotch-Irish lore, they burn a cross. Sound familiar? They also built an altar. And on that altar, they put 2 items: an American flag and a Bible. White Christian nationalism. This melding of race and religion and a form of patriotism into this toxic blend that essentially says this is a white man's country and we're going to make sure it stays that way. Christians were complicit in this. The color of compromise is white. But also, the color of compromise is red. And I'll warn you, I'm going to describe a lynching. And I do it not to be sensational, but because if we don't actually confront the physical violence that is part and parcel of white supremacy, then we will not respond to racism with the urgency that the problem requires. So, a moment ago I said whiteness has 3 results, 3 factors, 3 implications. I said it erases ethnicity, so it creates this equal and opposite category of black. The other thing that whiteness does is it says that in order to maintain power, violence is necessary. And so I want to read you this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, because I think it captures it well. He says, it's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. I think he captures it. The end result of this greed, the end result of this white supremacy is always physical violence. Why? Let me get theological for a second. Genesis 1, chapter 26 and 27 gives us the doctrine called the Imago Dei in Latin, and in English it means the image of God. It says, let us create humankind in our image and in our likeness. And it is this doctrine that tells us how to treat one another, that tells us that everyone is created in the image and likeness of God and so is worthy of equal dignity and respect. And this extends to all human beings, able and disabled, black and white, Christian and non-Christian, straight and gay, and everyone. It tells us how to treat one another. And so what happens when you subjugate an entire people group, like black people? There's something deep within us that says this isn't right. I'm worthy of dignity. I'm worthy of respect. I'm worthy of equality. Because I have the fingerprint of God on me. Just like you do. So that spirit of resistance wells up. But you're not going to mess with my bottom line. So when you get too uppity, when you start to assert yourself, I'm going to smack you down with physical violence if necessary. That's what happened in the case of lynching. We have nearly 5,000 recorded lynchings that we know of. This is just one example. It was 1904 in Mississippi. As with many of these cases, we don't know precisely what happened. We know there was some sort of a love triangle. Two male sharecroppers were in love with the same woman and had a dispute. One of the male sharecroppers gets the white plantation owner to come and confront this other black male sharecropper. They go to his cabin. An altercation ensues. And this black male sharecropper and the white plantation owner end up dead. Now, if that other black sharecropper had just killed another sharecropper, not that big a deal to white people. But he killed a white man, and not just any white man, a rich white man. And that was an automatic death sentence. So this man who had killed the white plantation owner, his name was Luther Holbert. He was in love with a black woman named Mary Holbert. When this happened, they went on the run. They ran for 3 days. They hid out in swamps. Mary even disguised herself as a man, but the posse caught up with them. The bloodhounds in the constant pursuit, they finally got them. But they didn't do the lynching right away. They waited for Sunday, when the most people could gather. And they didn't do it just anywhere, some open field or even in the town square. They did it on the property of a black church. Why a black church? Because historically, the black church has been the ark of refuge, the center for organizing and uplift in the black community. And so to conduct a lynching on the grounds of a black church says there's nowhere you're safe. Yeah. And they didn't just execute them, they tortured them. So, more than 1,000 people showed up to gawk at this lynching. The lynchers tied up the Holberts. First, the white murderers cut off each of their fingers and toes and gave them out as souvenirs. I often wonder what happened to those fingers and toes. Did they end up in someone's attic somewhere? Years later, did someone come across them and say, "What's this?" and just toss it? I wonder. Then they beat the bodies of Luther and Mary so mercilessly that one of Luther Holbert's eyes hung from its socket. Then the Vicksburg Evening Post reported the most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. The instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and woman in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out, the spirals tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time. Finally, the Holberts, who were still alive, were dragged to a pyre. They forced black men to drag them there. Then they lit Mary on fire so that Luther could see his beloved killed. And they lit him on fire again. Just one instance of the red, bloody violence of white supremacy and greed ultimately required. The color of compromise is red. So what do we do? In the book, I walk through 400 years of history, every major period of American history from the colonial era on up to the present, and I show Christian complicity with racism, and the question is now, what do we do? I don't know if we have audio. See?
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
That was August 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, and this comes before that fateful line, the part we all love to quote. The beginning of that speech, King sounds a very insistent tone. Did you hear that phrase? Come to this hallowed spot because of the fierce urgency of now, and I love that language. Urgency already tells you that something's happening, that action needs to be taken immediately. But it's not just any kind of urgency, it's a fierce urgency. An urgency that grips you and won't let you go. It's a fierce urgency that demands action, not soon, not gradually, not eventually, but now. The fierce urgency of now. It was 1963, over half a century later, when we look at race relations in this nation. In many ways, we can still say that we need to respond to the fierce urgency of now. Not that there hasn't been progress, but much more still needs to be done. So the question is, what do we do? At the end of the book, the last chapter, I propose a simple model. It's called the Arc of Racial Justice. It is an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. Now, before we unpack each of these, it's important to understand this is not a linear progress. You don't go to awareness and then graduate to relationships and then graduate to commitment, and now you can check all the boxes and you're done. It's a circular or a spiral process, and you're always engaging in one or the other, and sometimes all of them at once. It's also a never-ending process. No matter how far along you are in this journey of racial justice, you are always increasing your awareness and building relationships and redefining and recommitting to commitment to action. So it's ongoing. But when we talk about awareness, we're talking about a knowledge of how race and racism work. These are the things like coming to this talk and reading this book. I'll give you a couple concrete actions you can take to increase your awareness. You can watch some documentaries. Of course, there's a helpful one called 13th about the story of mass incarceration. There's another helpful one by Henry Louis Gates Jr. called The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. Talks about the history of African Americans in the United States. And there's one, if you can stomach it, because it's very difficult to watch, called When They See Us, about the Central Park Five, now the exonerated five. Miscarriage, a grievous miscarriage of justice that convicted these innocent black and brown boys, put them in prison. Here's another thing you can do to build your awareness. It's often my favorite answer when people ask me questions. It's just 2 words long, and the answer is this: Google it. You have so much information available at your fingertips. Never before have we had this much knowledge accessible so quickly and so easily. Not to know about racism is really a culpable offense at this point. You don't know not because you can't know, but because you don't care to know. So take action to build awareness, but don't stop there. You also need to build relationships. Again, to get theological for just a moment, when God wanted to reconcile humanity to God's self, God didn't send a tweet or an email. God sent a person, Jesus Christ, who took on flesh. Why? To express solidarity with human beings in the human condition, so that he could develop a relationship with people and come to know them, and they could come to know him. In a similar way, we're looking at reconciliation, genuine, robust, truthful, deep reconciliation. It's also going to require relationships, putting a face on oppression. To add to your awareness, read the book Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, a sociological account of how white evangelicals think about race. One of the things they talk about in that book is that white evangelicals are individualistic. Everybody in the West is pretty individualistic, but white evangelicals are even more individualistic than most Westerners. And this derives partly from their theology, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. When I open my Bible, it's me and my Bible, and I'm just interpreting it, and they translate that to race relations. The problem with race relations is one person not liking another person, and so if that's the problem, then the solution is, hey, I'm going to build relationships across the color line. We're going to go out to coffee. We're going to have potlucks. We're going to do pulpit swaps, and I can tell you, hey, some of my best friends are black. I'm not racist. What I always say is, you know what? It's good. I want you to build a relationship with me. I want you to endeavor to understand people who are different from you. I don't want you to hate me. But here's the thing. Relationships are necessary, but not sufficient. All the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to close the racial wealth gap. All the pulpit swaps in the world aren't going to do the thing about mass incarceration. So that's where we get to the commitment to actions against racist policies. And so I talk about things like reparations. How do you change the balance of financial power, which is imbalanced due to racism and white supremacy and race-based chattel slavery, sharecropping and convict leasing and a whole host of other things? How do you address voter suppression, which disproportionately impacts black and brown people and the poor? How do you change sentencing laws? All of these things are required if you want to take real anti-racist action. You have to commit to changing not just relationships, but racist policies as well. But I'll end with this. When it comes to, this is very cool. But when it comes to fighting racism, I don't think we have a how-to problem, we have a want-to problem. So if I gave you 5 minutes, a pen and a paper, you could all come up with a list of several anti-racist actions that would move us closer to racial justice. The question is not, brothers and sisters, really how to fight racism. The question is, will we fight racism? As you look across the scope of history, it's not that people didn't know what to do. It's that they weren't willing to do it. Only a precious few were willing to stand up, and instead of exercising compromise and complicity, they were willing to exercise a courageous form of Christianity that would confront the status quo and say, no more! We're not going to tolerate this anymore. And if we're going to make a change in this generation, courageous kind of action that's going to stand up in front of the racist status quo and say no more. We're not going to tolerate it. And we know it's not just going to go away on its own. A lot of people say, you know, if I was alive during the Civil Rights Movement, I would have marched with the King, I would have boycotted, I would have tweeted, I would have been on the Freedom Rides. Talk of a big game. But don't say you would have been active then if you're not active now. Brothers and sisters, we're in the midst of another wave of the civil rights movement. It never really goes away, but we're in another high point of it. And what you do now tells me what you would have done then. The time for compromise and complicity is long past. The time to exercise courageous action in the face of racism is now. Let's respond to the fierce urgency of now. Thank you very much.
This is a great book, and it's readable. And I don't often remember pages of books, but I remember page 21 of this book before I even pulled it up again. Let me read you part of page 21. The people who will reject this book will level several common objections. What stands out about these complaints is not their originality or persuasiveness, but their ubiquity throughout history. The same arguments that perpetuated racial inequality in decades past get recycled in the present day. Critics will assert that the ideas in the color of compromise should be disregarded because they are too liberal. They will claim that a Marxist communist ideology underlies all the talk about racial equality. They will contend that such an extended discussion of racism reduces black people to a state of helplessness and a victim mentality. They will try to point to counterexamples and say that racists do not represent the real American church. They will assert that the historical facts are wrong or have been misinterpreted. They will charge that this discussion of race is somehow abandoning the gospel and replacing it with problematic calls for social justice. It is up to the reader to determine whether the weight of historical evidence proves that the American church has been complicit with racism. Page 21, and the writing is just as good throughout. I wonder though, as I read that and as I anticipated some of you've spoken in a lot of places around this country and had probably some varied reactions. I wonder if you'd share a bit about how people have reacted to this book, and maybe specifically or including the people who might have had this initial reaction.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wrote that, and I'm sort of stealing from W.E.B. Du Bois in the preface to his book, Black Reconstruction, which is a corrective of the Dunning School of History, which characterized Reconstruction in the period following the Civil War when black people were getting enfranchised as never before, as a mistake. And so Du Bois is correcting that in his book, Black Reconstruction. He gives this wonderful presentation in the introduction where he says, there are some people who take the subhumanity of black people as a fact. And he said, this is not a book for you. I'm talking to the people who will take it as a given that black people are indeed full human beings worthy of equality with other people. And so in the same way, this book is not necessarily for people who aren't ready for the conversation. There are some people who are so sort of entrenched in their ideas of whiteness and the way the world should be in terms of how it's ordered that they'll reject this book out of hand. And I say simply, well, this book will be here when you're ready. And then, as to the actual reaction, I have to say I've been pleasantly surprised. Throughout the process of writing this book, I kept hearing all the trolls I had dealt with throughout the years in the back of my head and saying, okay, they're going to hate this part. They're really going to hate this part. But it is what it is. But I have to say that when the book came out, I think it came in the midst of a season in this nation and in the church when people were ready to hear something different. They were ready to learn something more. And I'm very grateful for that. And so I've heard some tremendous stories of transformation. I was saying earlier, a 66-year-old white man, I know his age because he told me, came up to me at one of my book talks and said, I'm a 66-year-old white man from the South. I thought a particular way about race until I read this book, and with tears in his eyes, he said, it changed me, and I want to thank you. And so I said, praise God, that's great. But there have been detractors. What's interesting is that using history as a vehicle has I think, been more accessible to a lot of people. It seems less polemical, less ideological, right? So for most of the history, from the colonial era through even the Civil War and the Jim Crow era, people are like, yeah, okay, I get it. It was bad, and they can ride. Then you get to the Civil Rights Movement, or the rise of the religious right, and that's where people start to push back. Now you've got lived history, people are still alive who lived through that period. Now you're talking about heroes that they've grown up with, heroes of the faith like Billy Graham, and saying, oh, he wasn't this sort of racial crusader that some people make him out to be. And then you talk about the rise of the religious right, where a lot of people who have supported that movement look at it as essentially a pro-life movement that coalesced to oppose abortion and Roe v. Wade and sort of take it as this noble moral crusade, but then you push the history back just a couple of years and you find it had a lot to do with tax-exempt status and losing that tax-exempt status because Christian schools were racially segregated in violation of the law. And so it's wrapped up in this idea of racism and segregation. So that's where most of the pushback comes. And then lastly, on the last chapter about ways to address racism, because I intentionally try to go beyond, hey, make a new friend. Great, right? But don't stop there. I talk about the systemic and the institutional and the policy aspects of racism, and that's all just sort of lumped in a box as liberal, Marxist, social justice warrior, critical race theorist, and all of that. And if it's that, then I don't have to listen to it.
When you talk about the history and especially the rise of the religious right, you quote Jerry Falwell Sr., the father of Falwell Jr., in his essay, Ministers and Marches. And so in the 60s, Falwell Sr. says, being a preacher of the gospel, I couldn't spare a minute to talk about these issues like civil rights, because that's politics. And then 20 years later, there's a different tune from certain leaders in that movement. So the history is in here as well, and the current history. I wonder, so you're a Christian, and you are talking to a people who, in some ways, share an element of your own tradition. And there's a set of resources that you're drawing from. I'm thinking particularly of some of the people engaging in current commentary. Roxanne Gay of the New York Times says, I'm done with forgiveness, which is actually a pretty honest statement from a certain perspective. But there's something more that you're calling for here. So say a little bit about what difference does it make to be a Christian in this conversation?
Well, I think, honestly, Christians have a lot to learn from non-Christians about racial justice. If we're looking at different institutions from the academy to entertainment to sports, even to business, there have been a lot more, at least gestures of diversity, equity, and inclusion in secular spaces than we often see in Christian ones. So I think Christians need to have the humility to say that there are other people who have been doing great work out there. That's why I benefit immensely from the work of historians and sociologists and others who may not be Christian, but have put a lot of thought and effort into understanding racial dynamics in this country. And to the extent that Christians sort of shove those resources aside, I think we impoverish ourselves. So we have a lot to learn from there. What I find in Christianity is some of the moral resources to undergird this push for racial justice, right? King talks about the arc of the moral universe being long that bends toward justice. Well, where does that moral arc come from, right? What is the standard for the way we treat each other. And so that gets back to, Genesis chapter 1 and the image of God. And I think this is something I say in different Christian contexts, but the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century sort of centered around the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, in contradistinction to what Luther and others saw were deficiencies in the Catholic Church. I think if there's going to be a reformation in the 21st century, it's the central doctrine of the core belief that we revolve around is the image of God. And how do you treat one another who are different from you? And if we can really excavate teachings like that, then I think it would inform us and transform us. And by the way, it's never going to be, I don't think, a majority. That may come eventually. But the people who are at the front of change, that tends to be a small group of committed people. So I don't want us to delude ourselves in this work of thinking that we're going to automatically have this broad base of support and people cheering us on. That probably won't happen. If you look historically, people who want to instigate change on behalf of the disempowered are not typically popular when they're there. So I also want to encourage people that if you don't have a big old group of people sort of linking arms with you, it only takes a few. It only takes a few.
The good thing is, though, at least today, money's not a part of the problem.
No, of course not. It's all attitude.
I was also struck that, even though you're talking about historical awareness, that at least we're here in St. Louis and don't have to think about any of those problems.
I'll tell you, St. Louis was instrumental in catalyzing me, particularly in terms of history. So when Ferguson happened and we had the rise of Black Lives Matter, I was trying to make sense of the situation. How you have something like a predominantly white police force coming to police a predominantly black community, and those kinds of questions. I found that historians often had the most helpful things to say. They were able to talk about restrictive covenants and redlining. They were able to talk about the origins of the police force, and they were able to give context to current events based on history that helped me make sense of what was happening and try to know better what to do. And so I'm indebted to this really tragic situation that happened in your community for leading me to history in particular as a way to understand our racial milieu, even in the present day.
We were on subject of history. We were privileged to have you in my class this afternoon, and as you were talking about history with me and my students, you were saying the contingency of history means that none of this was inevitable. And you went through and you gave some what-ifs, and I wonder if you might go through those again.
So one of the historical facts that really sticks out to me that's in the book, in 1667, the Virginia Assembly, a group of white Anglican men, passes a law that says that baptism does not confer freedom on a person of African, Native American, or mixed race descent. Basically what they're saying is, Jesus can have your soul, but we own your body. And ever since then, there's been this bifurcation of the physical and material over and against the spiritual. And it's this interesting thought experiment to say, well, what if? What if this group of white Christian men hadn't passed that law? What if they had said, we're going to carry over our tradition from Europe, which said you can't enslave another Christian? How might the racial landscape have looked different? What if? So it's interesting. Christian denominations were actually a bellwether and a foreshadowing of the Civil War, because in 1845 the Methodists split over slavery. In 1844, in 1845 the Baptists split over slavery. In 1861 the Presbyterians split yet again, and this time over slavery. But what if Christian denominations had taken the lead in unity and said that, Southern Baptist Convention, what got me was they split not just over the issue of slavery, but over the specific issue of whether a missionary could enslave people. So think about this. A missionary charged to go overseas, probably to nations in Africa, to share the gospel with them. Meanwhile, back home, he owns people of African descent, and that's okay. So that sort of contradiction and the mental gymnastics you have to do to make that okay are mind-boggling. But what if? What if they had said, no, that's not okay? And if you take that stance that you can enslave people and still be a Christian in good standing, then you need to go find your own thing. So the point is this. As we look from the perspective of 2019 back on U.S. history, all of this seems almost destined to happen. And what history teaches us is that there are particular people in particular places, in particular circumstances that made particular decisions, and they could have chosen differently. And that tells us now that we can have hope too. Because now we are particular people in particular places, in particular circumstances who can make particular decisions, and we don't have to make the same kind of decisions that reinforce racism and inequality that people before us did. We can make a different future.
So what are some of the what-ifs of 2019?
The big one is, what if there's not this one-to-one correlation between the modern white evangelical movement and the modern Republican Party? And I say this not to convince or persuade a Republican to be a Democrat or a Democrat to be a Republican, but to be a principled person in your party, especially if you're Christian, to hold your party accountable. And, you know, I was in these churches. I was a black person in these predominantly white churches and seminaries and contexts. In 2015, when Trump comes down the escalators, announces his candidacy by saying that some people crossing the border from Mexico are rapists, right? I'm in these churches when he calls some African countries and Haiti S-hole countries. I'm in these churches when he refuses to repudiate the full page ads he puts out about the exonerated five. And me and other people of color and women and immigrants and refugees and virtually every marginalized people are saying, hey, this is bad. Like, he's not even in power yet, and this rhetoric, we've heard it before, and we know it leads to bad outcomes for us. And I'm in these churches having these conversations and hearing people give lip service to reconciliation and to inclusion. And then when they get in the voting booth, it's as if our voices didn't exist. And what I came to understand very painfully, very personally in that season was that in many white Christian spaces, they value people of color for our presence, but not for our perspectives. So you can be there. But when it comes to changing and having our voices heard, you don't have that same commitment. Now, again, you know, I know there are some Republicans here and Trump voters. All I want you to hear from me is the impact that this has on your stated commitment to race relations. I encourage you all, here's an awareness category thing, read a New York Times article by Campbell Robertson entitled A Quiet Exodus. He profiled black Christians in white churches who made their quiet exit out of white churches, particularly because of the 2016 election and the feeling of betrayal and feeling like we weren't heard. And you can maintain your political convictions. All I'm asking you is to also deal with the ramifications as it comes to race relations as well.
Since we haven't said anything controversial yet, I'm wondering if we go to our word.
Yeah.
Reparations.
Word.
And you mentioned this at the end of the book, but it's a two-step move. So the first step is, let's think about this as a political matter. And then a quick caution from me on reparations, as we were talking earlier, my family was interned during World War II as Japanese Americans. My dad was born in the camps. In 1980, they all got 20 grand from the U.S. government, and there was a bit of a washing of the hands, as if we've done the handshake, we can move on. So there's a caution about some form of reparations. There's also the greater political challenge. But then you make the move and say, but churches could do this. Churches don't need a law to be passed, so they don't need a policy to be enacted. Churches could start with something like reparations within churches. So can you talk about that a bit? Have you seen that movement happening anywhere?
Right. So that's a great word about reparations. I think, even if it were somehow to make political progress in this country, there would certainly be the temptation on the part of many to say, okay, we wrote you a check, we made these financial arrangements, now we're done, let's move on. What more do you people want? It would be a great step, but it doesn't mean the conversation or the action is done. I made the case earlier that the color of compromise is green for the greed, and said, how can we really talk about racial justice if we're not talking about money? So General William Sherman, right after the Civil War, passes Field Order number 15, that takes a strip of land along the East Coast and apportions it to a portion of black people, 40 acres they would get, and a mule to work the land. This actually passes, people take possession of the land, but very soon after that, the order gets rescinded. And black people don't get their 40 acres in a mule, which is symbolic of economic independence, right? And so this formerly enslaved people are freed physically, but then put in the shackles of poverty. Which I live in the Mississippi Delta, cotton country. And there's a direct line from the generational poverty that makes the county where I live the fourth poorest county in the nation, back to sharecropping, to convict leasing, to race-based child slavery. There's a direct line. So usually when the question of reparations comes up, the first issue is practicality. How are we going to do it? Who do we determine gets it? How much are they going to get? It's so complicated that we can't do it. Well, the reason why it's complicated now is because we didn't do it in 1866. But it would have been real easy to figure out who gets it. And we kick the can down the road generation after generation after generation to where now it's incredibly confusing and difficult. So the answer now then is to say it's so confusing because it's been so long that we're not going to do anything, make it more confusing for the next generation. I don't think that's a great response. So there's a practicality question. Then there's a political question. It'll never fly. People aren't going to take this seriously. Which, again, North winning the Civil War, South winning the narrative war, there's something to that. But even now, you have Democratic candidates for president, even at least entertaining a committee to study reparations, which seems like a big move. It's only a committee, right? It's not over-expect. But that was not in the conversation even just one election cycle ago. So perhaps it's within the realm of political possibility. But regardless of all of that, if you read this history, if you agree that race-based child slavery was an economically exploitative system, and you're a Christian, why do you need to wait on the federal government to act? So there are churches, there are seminaries, there are colleges and universities that benefited from slavery, that benefited from segregation, and there's a debt. There's a financial compensation or reparation to be made. And so, some people talk about ecclesiastical or ecclesial reparations. And you can find a principle like this in the Bible. Zacchaeus was a tax collector who defrauded people. When he met Jesus and transformed his life, he said, anyone I've defrauded would have paid back 4 times what I defrauded you. And I'm going to give away half my money to the poor. Right? This whole idea of repair is a very biblical and Christian idea. I think if we look at it that way.
We've got about a little under 20 minutes left. I'm interested in hearing questions from you. For Jemar, we've got a couple of people with microphones, so you can wait for a microphone. There's one right here, right behind you.
Thank you, Jemar, for a very well-written book. I have really benefited from reading the book. So thank you.
Thank you.
When I read the last chapter, The Fierce Urgency of Now, one of the things that I wish you had included in that chapter was the connection of Africa to the African American. And full disclosure, I am someone who's lived half his life in Africa and half his life in the United States. And I currently live in that space. I was really encouraged when in your presentation you talked about how whiteness causes people to lose their ethnicity. Would you please comment on the importance of the connection of African Americans to Africa? Again, in full disclosure, I have come to the conclusion that the African American is not going to be truly American until he or she makes peace with Africa.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
That's good. Thank you so much for your comment and your question. You're absolutely right. There is a Pan-African connection. And I think activists now, and also especially during the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, were noticing the connection between the oppression of Black people or African people of African descent in the United States and globally, and connected to this colonialist, imperialist project that spans different nations. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to make more explicit, I need to make more explicit that connection to global Pan-African movement, because much of the dynamics are similar, not exactly the same, but similar. And I've heard from Africans from other countries that a lot of what I've written about in this book, even though it applies specifically to the United States, there's a lot of crossover and carryover there. So we do need, particularly as people of African descent, to recognize our interconnectedness and the joint project of liberty, because none of us are free until all of us are free. So, God willing, I'll be traveling to South Africa next week and can make some of these connections and hopefully can come back with enough material for a blog post, an article, or another book or something connecting our continents and experiences.
I have a big mouth.
Thank you so much for this, and I know it was a tedious endeavor in your book. I'm looking forward to getting in and reading it. And I'm not sure if this relates to the content in your book, or maybe it's something that's adjacent. But I'm really wrestling with internalized racial oppression as a Black woman in the context of a church. And I wonder if you have some thoughts that could speak to that, because I find that it's not just within me, but it's certainly something that's happening with the mass exodus of folk leaving the church.
Thank you. And in many ways, I need to be a student here and learn from you about your experiences as a Black woman in the church and in society. And so you'll see often online this hashtag or this phrase, listen to Black women.
Yeah.
And I think that is so true. Not only listen to, but follow and learn from Black women, because Black women exist at this intersection of race and gender, where they're experiencing this sort of multiple and exponential kind of oppression, which also though gives you a perspective on justice, because you experience so much injustice of what it looks like and what we should do. So I'm very encouraged by the example of the historic example of Black women, as well as Black women scholars. So the historic example of Black women, such as Harriet Tubman, who's in the news now because of that movie, of Ida B. Wells, of one of my heroes, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. These are people we have to highlight and learn a lot from. So I would encourage anyone to just read biographies of these people I named. In addition, some Black women historians out there are doing incredible work. One of my advisors, Jeanette Garrett Scott, is studying Black banking and finance and looking at the history of the way finance and capitalism has affected the Black community. Another historian, Tiffany Gill, wrote about beauty salons and beauty shops as sites of political activism and organizing, because they're one of the only places that black women had their own spaces. And then they were radical. They dreamed and envisioned what freedom would look like there. Keisha Blaine is founder and president of the African American Intellectual and Historical Society. And so I'm learning, here's a podcast I recommend, Truth's Table. Truth's Table. 3 black Christian women confident in their womanhood, confident in their Christianity, confident in their color, who teach me every time they get on the mic, talk honestly about their experience, particularly in black Christian spaces. So, black men, we are perpetrators of misogyny, that we have an immense responsibility for some of the oppression that our sisters feel. Again, I'm a student here and trying to get better at that. So it's one of these things that we can't separate from the issue of race. And I can say a whole lot more about gendered violence, about gendered labor with black women, that not only the physical labor of their hands, but the reproductive labor of having children. And they raise not only their own children, but often the children of the master's family, and not only their own children by black men, but their children by rape from white men. And just this heaping on of oppression has been so heavy. Was it Shaniqua Walker Barnes wrote a book called Too Heavy a Yoke, about black women constantly being complimented for their strength, but it's a strength they've had to develop because of the injustice that they've had to bear. It's not fair, it's not right. So I empathize as best I can, and I want to learn from it.
Jemar, this is a personal question, and I apologize if you've answered this before as it relates to your book. Sometimes there is an experience or a situation that's kind of the last straw that kind of, compels a person to write a book. So I wanted to know, was it like that? And if it was, what was that situation?
Yeah, that motivated me to write the book. It was a combination of situations. Like I said, Ferguson and trying to understand it and finding history was helpful, but this, it wasn't that long ago. There's this period from about the end of 2014 with Mike Brown and all the way up, you could even say to the present, but especially to around 2017. You remember what happened, right? We had not only Black Lives Matter, but you have this string of cell phone videos showing unarmed black people getting killed, and sometimes 2 in a week. And you could barely deal with one before another one came up. And then you had all of the controversy over what that meant, and all of the massive divisions between black and white sort of highlighted for me where we were racially. But it wasn't only that. You had things like the Emanuel 9 massacre and the rise of white supremacy. You had things like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And of course, in the midst of this, in 2015 with the primaries, in 2016 with the election, you had the election, right? And the 80 or the 81% of white evangelicals voting for the current president, and that revealing so much of the ideological gap between black and white Christians. And so it was this confluence of all of these events, and then I'm reading in my coursework hundreds of books about history where if race comes up and if religion comes up, and most of the time white Christians are on the wrong side of justice, and I'm getting mad. And I want to write this book as a way to sort of get that out there and have other people mad along with me, and perhaps if we all get mad together, we might do something about it. So it's a way to sort of share that burden and that pain. But there wasn't necessarily, I will say one particular moment stands out to me, the trauma that I'm really still trying to process was I remember the day of the election, it was after midnight when they finally called it for this current president. And I remember just being stunned, like, is this really just happening? Is this our new reality right now? And I mentioned earlier the podcast that I had passed the mic. I went on the mic with our producer who was just asking me questions in my response, and I said something that really made people mad. I said that Sunday following the election, I didn't feel emotionally, spiritually safe worshiping at a predominantly white church. Because it felt to me like it was dangerous. Because all this time, they've been making gestures of racial reconciliation and togetherness and diversity, and then when it really came to listening and hearing our voices, it felt like we were ignored. And I thought of the analogy of a blind spot when you're driving, right? The best of intentions, but a blind spot you can't see. So when you change lanes, you can hit someone else. And that someone else might be me, or my spouse, or my child. And so I said, no, I can't do it this Sunday. And some folks online got a hold of it, and they just went to town with it. Called me everything but my name. Questioned my theology, my orthodoxy. That's the move they always try to make, okay? So when you start talking about racial justice, all of a sudden you don't understand the Bible. You got to introduce you to these white theologians who will fix your understanding, right? And then they even question my salvation, like, you're not really a Christian, clearly, because you didn't support this man, right? Interesting. And then they made YouTube videos on it, they recorded podcasts, they wrote blog posts, they made comments. It was terrible, right? And it got to the point where I couldn't go online without my eyes twitching because of the stress, because I knew there was going to be some comment or whatever. So it was incidents like that, and I could name many, many more that happened to me sort of personally, that said, okay, part of the thing that we need to do is help people understand how we got here, racially speaking, and what the church had to do with it. And that's not the end all be all. This is just the start of the conversation, but hopefully start the conversation.
Hi, thank you. I wanted first just to mention that Virginia Theological Union is paying reparations to descendants of the slaves that worked and built that seminary. So there's a start. Second, I wanted to ask you how you see your work being as an outgrowth of or any connection to James Cone and Black liberation theology.
Yeah. So just a bit of background. So James Cone is, sort of regarded as the father of Black liberation, modern Black liberation theology. I think it's part of the Mormon tradition. But when I was in seminary, which was a predominantly white, theologically conservative seminary in the South, if James Cone or Black liberation theology came up at all, which it rarely did, then it was brought up as what not to do, how you got theology wrong. And so you read it to critique it. Meanwhile, we're reading the theology of slaveholders like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield without any hesitation or qualification. So that was the dynamic. And then I started reading Cone for myself. And he specifically says in his first book, Black Theology and Black Power, what he was trying to do was reconcile the messages of Martin Luther King and the messages of Malcolm X. And I think what he was tapping into was this centuries-long struggle of identity that Black Christians have had. How do you have an affirmation of your racial identity, as well as adopt the same religion that your oppressors practice? Right? So how can you be a Black Christian in a white Christian supremacist society? And so I think folks like Cone and Black liberation theology take Blackness seriously as a theological category in a way that's empowering, that argues back against, so there was a whole generation of Black Christians who, in the midst of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, a lot of people are saying, and this is a very long and old argument, that Christianity is the white man's religion. And there were Black Christians who were not willing to give up their Christianity, but wanted to affirm their embodied experience through Blackness, right? So I think what Cone and many others did, and Black womanist theologians later did, was take seriously the issue of a racial identity in a white supremacist society, and that Christianity could be in the hands of the powerful. It was a force for oppression, but in the hands of the marginalized and the oppressed, it was a force for liberation.
We have time for one more question.
So I was listening to you in Tyler the other day, and y'all was talking about
Did you leave a review?
Well, I'll be lazy. I have no wife to yeah. I'm 100. That's 100. So one of the things that y'all was talking about was, and it was the phrase, I might get the phrase wrong, but being able, you talking about when you were at the conference y'all put together up in the shot, you was talking about being able to be black without the seatbelt on.
Come on.
I'm like, was that, did I say that right?
That's it.
And so I just like, since you got the mic and you know you got the flow, you the man, if you could like just kind of tell some people here, like just encourage them and even people who don't really understand, like, cause I grew up, I'm a black boy who grew up in a white space and grew up in white evangelical Christianity. And so for me, just the idea of, if you could talk to, just speak to what it means and what it looks like or what it can look like to be able to be black without your seatbelt on and what that looks like and some of the emotional things they go through when you're trying to interact with your white brothers and sisters. And you're like, so I'll let you do your thing.
Yeah, that's good. Man, that's a great question. First of all, I need to get a picture. Y'all look good. You gotta do it for the brand. Everybody wave. All right, we'll do a quick video. Say cancel compromise. No, you gotta say cancel compromise. There you go, thank you. So what a lot of folks don't realize is if you're black in a white space, you can be black, but not too black. When it comes to your hair, your language, even in predominantly white churches, if I stand up and clap on a 1 and a 3, that's why I have to say it groups. You know, it's okay to talk back to me, right? Like that's something cultural in not even just black community, but a lot of minority communities, right? And what I'm all about, what I try to do wherever I go, is to tell black people specifically, and I say specifically black people because that's my experience and that's what I study. And I don't know the Native American experience or Asian American or Korean American or any of these other experiences, and also they're distinct, right? Your experience with Japanese and your heritage, right? That's distinct from
Asian American is not on the 1 and 3.
Okay. So I wouldn't dare presume to speak about that experience, right? And also, here's one of the things we say, we're the Witness, a black Christian collective. And for a long time, people were like, well, why aren't you like the multi-ethnic collective or the Mosaic collective or something like that? And I'm like, the more you try to be all things to all people, the less impact that you can have, right? So we focus on the black experience, right? And what we always say is that specific does not mean exclusive. And so it's so interesting if you go to our website, we have contributors of all races and ethnicities. The people who follow our content come from not only just the United States, but around the globe are accessing this stuff. And so somehow being specific, if you do it in a certain way, it doesn't mean being exclusive. When I go to, it can be Christian or secular campuses. You can be black but not too black, and that is soul crushing. Because it means I have to check part of my identity at the door for the sake of your comfort. It's not anything just or justified. It's just because you're not familiar with it, and me being my full black self is going to make you uncomfortable. And that's not right. And so I think one of the fastest ways we can create change is not to apologize for our blackness. Not to apologize for our cultural heritage. Because so much of the time we are black, but black with a seatbelt on. So what we try to do in this conference is be like, no, take the seatbelt off. Do what you gotta do, and be you. So we were very strategic. Everybody who touched the main stage was black. From the AV person to the keynote speaker, black. All of our conference presenters for workshops were black except one. He was a white guy who did a workshop for white people, and he's on our team. So we already had his invitation to the cookout. And especially when you talk about Christian spaces, right? I came up in a lot of white evangelical spaces, and it's very difficult to be a person of color in general and a black person in particular in those spaces. So we wanted a conference, and we got this. We had students from Christian colleges come and say, I didn't know I could be black and Christian. I didn't know I could be that black and Christian. And this is okay. And I said, praise God, because now you're going away a little bit more liberated, a little bit more free. And I really want you to go back with a holy restlessness wherever you are, your corporate world, your school, your church, and say, no, I've seen what it's like to be my full self. And it's not heretical, it's not evil, it's not tiptoeing, and I'm not going to settle for anything less wherever I go. And that way you become that liberated from my
I don't know about you, but I would love to stay all night. However, it's 9:05 and we want to honor your time. I will be walking Mr. Tisby up to a book table to sign books. They are for sale. There's also a little reception. So please join us, but do not, if it's okay with you, mob us up here so you can get up there and continue the conversation. Thanks for coming.